Hey, Duck Steve here, and I've been getting pestered by a certain Bible verse, really ever since I did the video on Roberto Orozco Ramirez, who is an undocumented immigrant who lives in Montana with his family and lived there until he was detained by ICE in January. And the verse is Proverbs 31:8, and here's what it says. Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Since I really couldn't get this verse out of my head, I thought, well, maybe I should do some more stories about immigrants, both documented and undocumented, whose rights have been trampled on by this administration's immigration policies. And maybe add a little fact-checking on the side. But over the last few weeks, it's become clear that there's another group who has no voice that needs to be spoken up for. And I'm talking about the people of Iran. Here's your first interesting factoid about Iran. Depending on which poll you use, somewhere between 75 and 95% of in-country Iranians want regime change. This is the group of people I'm talking about, and I'm going to take the average, and I'm going to call this group the 85%. The 85% want change, not only because their government is repressive and trampling on their rights, but also because there's been decades of sanctions against Iran because of its presumed nuclear ambitions. Here's an example of how repressive this regime is. Just in January of this year, the government killed between 7,000 and 30,000 people who were just protesting. So the 85% have been beaten down pretty badly. But recently there was a burst of hope for them because in the days and weeks coming up to the war that our president and the prime minister of Israel started against Iran, there was a lot of talk on the part of our president of regime change. And that gave a lot of people there some hope. Now, I'm not much of a fan of war, and especially not an illegal war, which this war was, both internationally and by U.S. law. But if we're going to do an illegal war, regime change in Iran is about as good a reason as I can think of for doing it. Unfortunately, very early on, really within a day or two, it became clear that our government's idea of regime change was after they took out the leaders and some of the military, the people of Iran would rise up and take over. This was a pretty darn naive view. On the surface of it, makes sense because it's 85%. I mean, why can't the 85% take over from the 15%? But factoid number 2, which I'm about to share, is going to show why that's really a complete pipe dream. You see, unlike in the US of A, where your demented grandmother can own an AK-47 if she wants, gun ownership in Iran is extremely restricted. You have to be in the military or the Islamic Revolutionary Guard. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard is the unit that's responsible for domestic control and protests, and they're the guys who basically killed 7,000 to 30,000 people back in January. They are ideologically highly committed. Between active duty and volunteers that they can call up, they can actually get a force of about 1 million people, and these are the weapons that they have. Machine guns, assault rifles, submachine guns, sniper rifles, all manner of other guns, and actually a smattering of more significant weapons. What does the 85% have? Sticks and stones, but you got to be awfully good throwing stones to take out one of these guys. President Trump stopped talking about regime change within a couple of days, except to say that he had already obtained regime change because the former leaders were dead. But it's become clear that this new regime is actually more conservative, more repressive, and not at all an improvement for either us in the West or for the 85%. When you throw in the fact that our bombing has caused a tremendous amount of damage and killed a ton of civilians, not only do we not help the 85%, we're hurting them, and we're hurting them badly. I really have to talk about the other 2 reasons that our president has put forward in order to justify this war against Iran. And the first one is that there was evidence of an imminent threat to the U.S. mainland of nuclear weapons from Iran. Factoid number 3, our president received on his desk less than a year ago a report from his own intelligence service detailing Iran's capability for delivering a nuclear weapon to U.S. soil. And this is what that report said. If Iran wants to develop a ballistic missile capable of reaching the U.S., and there's no actual evidence that they do, it's going to take them at least 10 years to come up with a design and produce a missile that can deliver a nuclear device to the U.S. Now, obviously, imminent means different things to different people. If you're a species staring down extinction, yeah, 10 years is very, very imminent. But if you're an average person walking around this planet in 2026, it's actually about 9 years and 364 days short of being imminent. The other reason given, and this is the one that's focused on most right now at the time of this recording, is to get rid of Iran's enriched uranium stockpile. And this is obviously a good idea. Everybody except for the government of Iran actually wants it really throughout the world. It's become quite clear, though, even after billions and billions of dollars of military hardware being poured out on Iran, if you're going to do that militarily, it's going to be boots on the ground, and probably lots of boots on the ground. Now, I have to say, if this is the reason for the war, I think this war is going to go down in history as Trump's war. Not only because President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu started it, but because President Trump, in his first term, did something that made this war necessary. So, a little historical backtrack here. Back in 2015, during President Obama's second term, multiple countries, including the U.S., entered into an agreement with Iran to limit its capacity to produce enriched uranium. Now, this was not a perfect agreement. Nobody thought it was a perfect agreement, but after decades of Iran insisting that they wanted to keep what they termed their peaceful nuclear program, and it was a non-starter to get rid of that completely, it was thought that a compromise agreement to slow down the capacity that Iran had to make enriched uranium was the best choice. So the agreement was in return for reducing some of the sanctions which, by the way, hadn't worked in getting Iran to decrease their nuclear program at all. In exchange for that, Iran was going to submit to very aggressive and invasive inspections, which they'd never done before, including random and unscheduled inspections. They were going to also start destroying some of their equipment for enriching uranium. And there were other things, too, that Iran was committed to doing. But basically, the idea was, let's go with this and see if we can build up some trust and go beyond that. In 2018, President Trump said, we don't like this agreement, we're getting out of it, we're slapping sanctions back on Iran. Again, sanctions which didn't work in the past and which hurt the 85%. Interestingly, Iran kept their side of the bargain for another year because the other nations hadn't done the same thing. But when it became clear that the sanctions were hurting them, they dropped out of the agreement too and started getting back to enhancing uranium. At the time that President Trump dropped out of this agreement, Iran had no highly enriched uranium. At this point, Iran has an estimated 970 pounds of highly enriched uranium at the level of 60%, which is just below weapons grade. So let me spell it out for you. President Trump gave up on a process that was actually starting to work, maybe slowly, maybe too slowly, and went back to a policy that hadn't been working for decades. So it's not far-fetched at all to say that if you're going to use this as the reason for this war, President Trump is the one that made it necessary. So getting back to speaking up for those who cannot speak for themselves, in the last 3 weeks, President Trump has made several threats like destroying all your bridges, destroying all your power plants, sending Iran back to the Stone Age, completely destroying a civilization. Most recently, he's backed off a little bit on that. He still talks about it some, but mostly he's put into effect a blockade. Now, who's going to hurt from blowing up all the bridges and the power plants? The 85%. Who's going to be hurt by sending Iran back to the Stone Age? The 85%. Even if when you're talking about just this blockade, who's that going to hurt? Well, it's not going to hurt the leaders. They're going to have enough to eat. It's not going to hurt their Islamic Revolutionary Guard. They're going to eat. It's going to hurt the 85%. And in view of all that, I have a question for our leaders, both Pete Hegseth and President Trump. Here's the question. If we're not going to help the 85%, can we at least not beat the crap out of them? Thanks for watching. See you next time.